Hey everybody, welcome to World History. Let's go ahead and get started with our first section of Chapter 30. So go ahead and get your notes out, please. Alright, so laying the groundwork a little bit, and we kind of introduced this last chapter. We have two sides facing off in Europe. We have the US and NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, on one side, versus the Soviets and the Warsaw Pact on the other. Both are going to become known as superpowers due to their vast influence, armies, and nuclear arsenals. Remember, we briefly talked about that last chapter when we talked about post-World War II stuff. It's also here we have to talk about the Iron Curtain, which is the dividing line between democratic Western Europe and communist Eastern Europe. Now, Eastern Europe is not going to go down without a fight. They are going to attempt to resist communism. The democratic part of West Berlin, which we've talked about last time, was doing really well, and workers are going to flee Eastern Berlin to West Berlin. So the Soviets are going to put up a wall to stop them from leaving, the Berlin Wall. We'll talk more about that later on in this chapter. It's important to note, revolts in Eastern Europe in the 1950s saw several movements of opposition to Soviet policy, and countries that had tried to leave the Warsaw Pact or perform any economic reform or embrace democracy were invaded by the Soviet Union and placed under strict Soviet control. Now, again, we talked about the use of atomic weapons last chapter. By 1949, the Soviets had effectively designed their own. By 1953, both the United States and the Soviet Union had developed the hydrogen bomb, 1,000 times more powerful and deadly than the atomic bomb. So here we are into a weapons arms race, with the US and the Soviets racing to get more and better weapons than each other. Now, this brings out the idea of MAD, or mutually assured destruction. The idea that if both sides launched, both would be destroyed. This prevented open warfare, which is why we call this conflict the Cold War. We don't have any direct actual fighting. Now, we also worked to try to limit nuclear weapons. During the Cold War, both sides did meet to make progress towards reducing the threat of nuclear weapons. In 1963, they signed the Test Ban Treaty, and in 1968, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation, or NPT, Treaty. This was saying, okay, we're not going to test as many out there, and we're not going to steal them from other countries. By the 1970s, there's also going to be some more agreements. This was an era of détente, or relaxation of tensions. And in 1972, we have the SALT I Treaty, or the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, which froze the existing number of nukes at what they were, so neither side could make more. We're also going to have the ABM Treaty, or the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. These are missiles that can shoot down other missiles. Essentially, it was establishing this and providing more security for the development of those programs. By 1979, we'll have SALT Round 2, which set the limit on the number of nukes. And by the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan of the United States is going to launch a program to build a Star Wars. This is essentially a missile defense system against nuclear attack. The other major treaties we'll have to talk about are in 1991 and 2010, respectively, both of them being the START treaties, or Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. Now, these reduced the number of nukes in 1991. We're going to sign a new one in 2010 and reduce that number of nukes as well. If you've been paying attention to current events as well, the Russians currently just left this treaty just a couple of months ago at the time of filming this in March 2023, excuse me. So eventually, the Cold War is going to go global. We had already established alliances with other nations around the world. You learned this by doing your map assignment. Local conflicts around the globe would turn into Cold War hotspots, specifically in parts of Asia, namely both Korea and Vietnam, which we'll talk about later on this chapter. Now, it's important to know the US, the Soviet Union, and China will all play crucial roles in both of these conflicts, with the US supporting one side, typically the democracy and democratic side, with the Soviet supporting the more communist or radical side of things. Like I said, we'll talk about both of those events later on this chapter. But really, we have to talk about a big event here in our own backyard, the Cuban Missile Crisis. You'll talk a lot more about this next year when you take US history, but this is just kind of a primer and introduction. By the 1950s, Fidel Castro had overthrew the previous dictator and took control of Cuba. And Cuba went communist and asked for the Soviet Union's help. So in 1962, as part of helping Cuba, the Soviet Union gave a nuke to Cuba. Now, if you don't know anything about geography, Cuba is essentially in the United States' backyard. It is literally only like 50, 60 miles off the coast of Florida. Now, Americans are going to respond with a blockade, and U.S. President John F. Kennedy is going to demand the missile be removed. 13 days later, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove the Soviet Union missiles. Khrushchev took over after Stalin, after his death. War would be averted with this, and the world dodged a bullet, and it might have come to nuclear war if they had launched. It was honestly a very terrifying experience in the United States, realizing, oh hey, Cuba has a nuke, and they could literally aim it at the United States, and there's nothing we could do to stop them if they launch it. So a little bit more on Soviet leadership. Communists are going to value obedience, discipline, and economic security. They're going to seek to spread their ideology or value system and beliefs around the globe. Like I mentioned, Stalin will die in 1953, and Nikita Khrushchev will take over. He's going to close the prison camps and ease censorship. So really, when we talk about the spectrum of communism, Lenin and Stalin are very staunch, like very strict by the books, really strong amounts of communism. Khrushchev is kind of like, hey, let's take it a step back a second. We're still going to be communist, but we don't need all these prison camps, and we don't need to censor the public as much. That'll change when Leonid Brezhnev will take over, Khrushchev's successor, who held power from the mid-1960s to about 1982. All of Khrushchev's changes are going to be reversed, and anybody that criticized Brezhnev will face arrest and imprisonment. So really, like I said, Russian and Soviet leaders are kind of on a spectrum as to how much they embrace communism versus how much they enforce it. So, a little bit on the US. Well, it wasn't just a military rivalry. This was a competition between two contrasting economic and political value systems. Now, straying into economics for a minute. Communist countries typically had command economies. The government was in complete control. Versus capitalist countries like the US, where we have market economies, where citizens have the freedom to make economic and political choices. Market economies also see producers and consumers making those economic decisions for themselves. Command economy, you have no options. You buy what is provided, and that is it. So in terms of containing the Soviet Union, we embraced an idea known as containment, essentially keeping communism within its existing boundaries and keeping it where it was. This was the U.S. policy of containing the Soviet Union, and this is pretty much going to define U.S. foreign policy, specifically with the Soviet Union, from the mid-1940s, so after World War II, through the 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapses. Living in a nuclear age, people were extremely fearful of nuclear fallout and bombs. This led to people to build bunkers and fallout shelters. And in schools, you know how we have things like fire drills and tornado drills. They also had nuclear drills. You want to know what they did to protect themselves from nuclear bombs? You are to climb under your desk and duck and cover your head. Essentially like what we do for an earthquake drill. Now, this also led to a lot of fear in the United States. This is the Red Scare, or a fear of communists. Senator McCarthy is going to lead a witch hunt for communists. And I'll see if I can find a good video to explain McCarthyism a little bit. But I do believe, yep, that is it for your notes for today. So your assignment is to do the Shag Castro packet that is posted on Google Classroom. Beyond that, please make sure your map is done and completed, and please work on your review guide. You should have received it already, and you can fill out the Section 1 portion of your review guide. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all next time. Bye, everybody.